All right, so I'm going to try to struggle through this for Wrasslin lesson because I am still apparently sick because my body can't handle a cold to save its life. So
Right.
we're going to be talking about other controversies that the NWA has been surrounded with. And a company that's been around since the early 40s, they're
They're going to have
bound.
a lot of things.
Not as much as you think. So the first one was the structure of the NWA system, because the president of the company, they basically controlled the championships and who joined the NWA. So there were claims of bribing, playing favorites. There were possible prostitution that actually brought in with there to allow certain companies into the NWA, because at that time the NWA was very prestigious. To this day, those claims have not been vindicated
Right.
or
and
proven.
they probably never will.
No. Would I be surprised?
No.
Not necessarily.
That was his business in the 50s
Right.
and 60s.
And also Lou Fez, who was the basically dominated the NWA at that time, was very cozy with the president of the company, to the point where Lou Fez was booking himself. But the thing was, he never really had to do that because Lou Fez was a legitimate tough man.
Right.
That was another controversy that I at least wanted to touch on, because once again, it was one of those situations where it was obvious.
Right.
So one of the big examples of favoritism was the Mildred Burke split with Billy Wolf, and how that affected Mildred Burke's career, because it did quite a bit. So Billy Wolf was the pseudo booker of women's wrestling back in the day, from the 40s to about the 60s, before the fabulous Moolah took that over. And the public breakup between Mildred Burke and Billy Wolf was damaging to her career, because the NWA, number one, did not recognize women's wrestling at all. They did it because of Billy Wolf and his relationship with the company. But they also saw that women's wrestling was a draw. And they really pushed that in that way. So as soon as that happened, they blackballed Mildred. They took out the women's champion for a very long time, and it really did not come back into the Mildred Burke legacy. Really did not come back until way after she died.
Right.
And it's extremely unfortunate that she had to deal with that as well. And this happened in the early 50s, so still somewhat early within the career of, or in the life of the NWA, but it was one of the bigger controversies that came out later.
Okay.
Now, another controversy, not because there is an attachment to the Mildred Burke situation, but the June Byers controversy also was different, because she was known for being the flavor of the night for a lot of the presidents and the powers of be of the NWA.
Sleeping her way to the top.
Essentially. So June Byers she won the women's champion from Mildred Burke. And at that time, there were only 2 out of 3 falls matches for champions. And this was the first big screw job, because it was 1-1 for the pinfalls, and the referee that was assigned to it just stopped the fight and got June Byers out of the ring, because it was chaos at that time. And June Byers was declared the winner.
Okay.
There was no third fall or anything to indicate that that was going on.
Right.
The other weird thing is that June Byers at that time was fairly unknown.
Right.
She got into this opportunity with a 13-woman tournament where half of her matches seemed a little fixed. To the point where people were like, this June Byers, I mean, this was literally, people were about to kill these people.
Right.
It was that crazy. So Byers had to basically be dragged out by police so she didn't die.
Right.
But she was the women's champion, and her entire reign was just controversy after controversy, because there were opponents that people were like, she was the opponent for June Byers. This is the women's champion.
Right.
Like, you have to get better people. So they were booking her in ways where she couldn't lose.
Right.
And eventually she did retire as champion, and they just did it that way. And this really did not come out until later either, because this was the 40s, and the NWA were very powerful financially.
Yeah.
And, I mean, if you think there is corruption and stuff now, 40s and 50s corporate America was insanely corrupt. You can't talk about NWA controversies without talking about Black Saturday.
Yeah, and this is a story that's been done over and over again.
Right.
But
just as a thing, McMahon did not buy any NWA property.
no, he bought the
the
time slot.
channel.
Right. Oh, he bought the channel.
It was the channel that the NWA was on. He was filling that time slot
right.
at that
he
time.
bought that time slot.
And Ted Turner did not like him. So this was very early on within that. So that's why it's Championship Wrestling from Georgia,
Right.
not World Championship Wrestling yet.
Right. But
Because-
this was the reason why WCW was started.
Yes, this was literally the moment that happened because McMahon and Ted Turner already had beef.
Right.
And McMahon got the opportunity to gain this time slot on a Turner Network channel, and Turner being the southern businessman that he is, was like, no, I want Southern wrestling, not this Northern wrestling.
Right.
So, very, very brief. It was literally one moment, but this is pretty much the kickoff of the WCW era and eventually the Attitude Era. Now, this one is going to be different because this does involve Lou Thesz. So this was the Thesz Carpentier incident, where the dominant champion Lou Thesz lost to a wrestler up in Canada named Edward Carpentier, and it was litigious on why he lost because it was a disqualification, and so Carpentier was the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, but Lou Thesz went back to America claiming that he was still the champion. Now, there weren't a lot of territories up in Canada at this time that were members of the NWA, so Lou Thesz defending the champion up there at all was very, very strange. So at that time, there were two world champions of the NWA, and if you go up to Canada, they'll say that Carpentier was the champion at that time. In America, it was Thesz. And eventually, and Carpentier actually lost the champion a couple of times while they were trying to sort this out as well. Because Carpentier, he was a fine wrestler, but not uber great. But eventually, Thesz won out. This was in 1958, and he was the champion. And that's kind of what happened there. But keep in mind, too, this was shoot. This was not the performance stagehands that you know now, because that didn't start until Toots Mondt became involved in wrestling up in the WWF. So it was still very much a shoot-based wrestling thing. Now, this incident was very controversial because this involved the business style of the NWA. And it does involve the NWA World Heavyweight Champion, Big Gold, showing up on WWF television. Now, Flair at that time was the champion, and he was the Big Gold Belt guy. But because of how the NWA at that time had their champions, where they put down a $25,000 deposit for the upkeep and protection of the champion, and when the company decided to take the title from that champion, they got back that $25,000 security deposit. So Flair was having issues with the NWA. He left and joined the WWF, and they refused to give Flair back the $25,000 to get the belt back from him, which led to Bobby Heenan saying that Ric Flair was the real world's champion on WWF television, kicking off Flair's rise within that company. Now, the WWF was sued. They were threatened. They were harangued for this because even though this was a lot later, this was in the early 90s, this was still a fairly big deal. and they kept the structure of the NWA for that long. Eventually, they decided to drop it because the NWA did give Flair back the deposit after lawsuits to get the title off of television, and Flair would continue to do the gimmick of the Real World Champion, but he used a replica of the WWF Tag Team Champions instead. And he only did that on house shows. Right. So it really kind of just stopped abruptly, but he was still in the world title picture because, you know, it's Ric Flair.
In the early 90s.
Right. And obviously we got to talk about the current incident with Billy Corgan and Nick Aldis. I wouldn't say in any more detail than we have already covered it because it's still a developing story.
Yep.
But well, now given who is the world champion and how controversial that was, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. But the NWA, I mean, I'm pretty sure I've missed a few of them, but I just kind of wanted to give the flavor of the month of the controversies that surrounded the NWA.
Absolutely.
And, you know, just kind of shady shit that they did in the past, but when you've been around since the 40s, you're going to have some skeletons in the closet. But when we come back, we're not only going to make NWA Hard Times majestic again, but we're going to make pro wrestling majestic again.